They had driven miles away from any town, far from the city lights, into the desolate rural landscape that stretched endlessly under the darkening sky. Mark and Jenna, both seasoned paranormal enthusiasts, had explored countless abandoned buildings and eerie locations, but tonight felt different. The graveyard they stood in was ancient, its headstones cracked and crumbling, nearly forgotten by time. No one lived near it for miles. As they switched on their equipment, hoping for an EVP or a glimpse of the unexplained, a strange sound rippled through the still night air. It wasn't wind, it wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was something else, something hidden, just out of sight. And for the first time, they weren't sure they wanted to know what it was. Chapter 1. A Grave Venture. The night was unnaturally quiet, with no distant hum of cars, no animals rustling in the brush. Mark glanced at Jenna, his flashlight beam tracing the outline of the old weathered gravestones. "This place is perfect," Jenna whispered, excitement creeping into her voice. "We're bound to catch something here." Mark nodded, though his unease grew with every step. The chill in the air clung to their skin, heavier than the cold usually felt. As they reached the center of the graveyard, they set up their voice recorders and EMF meters, their usual tools for contacting the beyond. Just as they turned on the recorders, a faint sound cut through the silence, a distant, low hum. It was rhythmic, like breathing, but there was no one else around for miles. Mark's eyes darted toward the far end of the graveyard, where the mist seemed thicker, curling around the stones. "Did you hear that?" Jenna asked, her voice now tinged with hesitation. "I heard it," Mark replied, "but I don't see anything." As they stood frozen in place, the hum stopped. All that was left was the silence, deeper, darker, and more oppressive than before. Then it came again, closer. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Mist. The two huddled together, Jenna gripping the EVP recorder like a lifeline. "We should at least see what we caught," she suggested, though her voice trembled slightly. Mark nodded, turning on the playback. The static filled the speaker for a moment until something broke through, a whisper, faint but clear. "Go." Jenna's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Before Mark could respond, the same sound, the strange rhythmic hum, sounded again, only this time it was unmistakably closer, much closer. It felt as if it were coming from all around them, pressing in through the mist. "Who's there?" Jenna called out, her voice wavering as she scanned the graveyard with her flashlight. There was no response, just the oppressive stillness that now seemed to pulse with something unseen. Suddenly, from the farthest edge of the graveyard, there came a scraping noise, like stone dragging against stone. Both of them turned, hearts racing toward the sound. One of the tombstones, an enormous ancient slab, was slowly tipping forward as if being moved by invisible hands. "Mark, let's get out of here," Jenna whispered, her earlier bravado dissolving, but as they began to back away, the mist itself seemed to shift and swirl, forming shadowy shapes just beyond the edge of their vision. Chapter 3. Something Follows. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But something about the way the shadows moved, almost as if they were watching, made her legs freeze in place. Mark grabbed her arm, breaking her trance. "We need to go," he muttered, his voice low and urgent. Together they started toward the gravel path that led back to the car. The mist swirled around their ankles, the air thick with an electric tension. But the further they walked, the more the landscape seemed to shift. Gravestones that should have been familiar appeared misplaced, the path stretching farther into the fog. "What the hell?" Mark whispered. They had been walking for 10 minutes, but the car was nowhere in sight. The sound of footsteps behind them, light and quick, stopped them cold. They turned slowly, half expecting to see another adventurer, maybe a prankster, but there was nothing. Just the rows of ancient graves and the swirling mist. Then a voice, a low, gravelly whisper, echoed through the stillness. "Stay." Jenna grabbed Mark's hand. "Let's run," she said, her voice barely audible. They bolted, dashing through the fog, but the footsteps followed. Chapter 4. The graveyard closes in. The mist thickened with every step, and the once familiar rows of headstones now formed a disorienting labyrinth. The footsteps were no longer subtle. They were heavy, pounding against the earth as if something enormous was following them, gaining speed. "Where's the car?" Mark yelled, panic setting in. Jenna couldn't answer. Her lungs burned from the cold, wet air, and her legs felt like they were trudging through quicksand. It was as if the graveyard itself was holding them back, twisting and warping the landscape around them. Suddenly they burst through a clearing, and there it was, the car. The sight filled them with a fleeting sense of hope. But before they could reach it, the mist rolled over the vehicle, swallowing it whole. A deep guttural sound echoed from behind them, a growl that didn't belong to any animal. The air vibrated with its menace as if the ground beneath the graveyard was shifting. Trembling, Jenna glanced back and froze. There, standing just at the edge of the mist, was a figure. No, not just one. Several. Dark shapes with hollow, empty eyes staring at them through the fog. Chapter 5. Escape or Embrace. Jenna's breath hitched as the figures began to move, slowly at first but with purpose. Mark grabbed her hand, yanking her forward. "The car! We have to make it!" But every step felt like an eternity. The mist grew thicker, the whispers louder. Jenna stumbled, her knees hitting the cold earth. She looked up and saw the figures closer now, reaching, stretching toward them with impossibly long arms. Mark pulled her to her feet, his face pale, eyes wide. "We don't have time!" he shouted, but Jenna's gaze locked onto something beyond the figures. A headstone newly unearthed, with her name etched into it. The world around them began to spiral, the graveyard twisting into something unrecognizable. The mist swallowed the car entirely, and with it, their only hope of escape. And then, the growl came again, low and resonant, as the ground beneath their feet cracked open.